Good evening. Welcome to DeFacto Review, our weekly in-depth analysis on the current affairs and news, with our commentator, Mr. Narambat.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
And I'm your host, Namsred Sindh. You can join in on our conversation on Facebook Live on MNB World page and on Twitter via Jargal_DeFacto. So for our today's topic, is the referendum the right choice? Corruption case of customs inspector exposed. Joint investment fund between Mongolia and Russia. And let's get into our first topic about the referendum of the parliament. So the second discussion about the amendments to the constitution during the extraordinary session of the parliament ended, and the Mongolian People's Party made a proposal to call for a referendum about this issue. Along with this decision, the president of Mongolia withdrew his constitutional amendment bill, and with the draft for public vote, a new proposal whether or not to include a question about changing the form of the government in the referendum was made. So let's get into our question. Our first question is, could you tell our audience about the importance of the referendum?
Oh, absolutely. This is quite important because this is the very first kind of referendum that will take, say, in 25 years. Because if we recall, in 1992, there was a very first referendum in Mongolia prior to adopting the constitution in 1992. And now, after 27 years, after 27 years of struggle, acquiring the right expertise and knowledge and experience, I think it's the right time to make such referendum, because obviously the current constitution is failing to serve its purposes.
I see. So some people are concerned that this referendum could be manipulated by the government officials. Is that possible? Is there any chance that it could be manipulated?
Well, technically speaking, it's quite possible that the public opinion could be manipulated. But let me get back to a main point where the President Batulga said in the event of the partial acceptance of the constitutional amendments, it will not serve its purposes. It will neither fish nor the flesh. So that's the main concern. But as an ordinary citizen, and speaking from my experience, I see that, and I'm speaking with my friends who has an access to the information, it appears to be, an ordinary Mongolian doesn't much understand about the constitutional amendments. So, yes, the constitutional amendment referendum should take place. Yes, it should take place. But before the referendum, I think the key thing is the parliament, they should educate, first of all, about the amendments.
Right.
And then people should comprehend what the constitutional amendments are about. And after that, of course, we should require quite an active participation of the public organizations, NGOs, general public, to stand against the possible meddling or manipulation.
Right. So right after the first discussion about the amendment of the constitution, there was a referendum called, right?
Yes.
But was it conducted?
Yeah, in 1992, yes.
No, but now that Mongolians are calling for the referendum for the second time.
No, it's not a calling for a second. I think, we have to get back. It was a second discussion of proposed constitutional amendments.
Right.
And on last Friday, the MPP, they proposed, because of the president withdrew his amendments and said, this is leading nowhere, basically. It's a useless discussion and debates. And they proposed, okay, let's make a nationwide referendum whether these constitutional amendments are required or not. So, and as far as our sources tell, they say around October or November of this year, the referendum itself will take place.
Would they be able to educate the public about the amendments before that timeline?
Oh, that's quite challenging, to be honest. That's quite challenging, to be honest, because prior to that referendum, as I said, and to stand against the meddling of the public opinion, the general public should be well educated, and that's quite a challenging job, to be honest, in my opinion.
I see. So, if the Constitution Amendment draft is cancelled and people vote, if the people vote against the amendments, will the Constitution Amendment be cancelled, or would the referendum may be postponed?
Well, I think, to me, it's obvious after 27 years of half parliamentary and half presidential constitution, everyone understands that the new amendments should be applied. So I don't think so that the public will vote against the constitutional amendments. After all, if we look at the referendum itself, that referendum is meant to unite Mongolians rather than divide.
Right.
So that's my guess. And if, just in case, let's say scenario B, if public vote against the constitutional amendments, in my opinion, it will rather be postponed than cancelled.
I see. So there could be a chance that 2 referendums be called for.
Well, technically speaking, yes. Yeah, technically speaking, yes. Yeah.
What is the point of postponing it if the people already voted against it and it is settled?
Well, and as I said, I think the constitutional amendments are required one way or another.
I see.
Because after all, there are certain people they want to see Mongolia following convert Mongolia as a presidential country. Some vote and think and keen to see Mongolia as a parliamentary country itself, right? So those are fundamental questions that need to be answered one way or another, because we are hitting the deadlock. And there's a good article written by the Mr. Jargal DeFacto himself a few weeks ago called "A Stalemate in Mongolianized Governance," and he said that our current constitution was so many times adopted and amended that it's right now serving the needs of the corrupt politicians. So there is an urgent call to make the constitutional amendments.
So the president proposed to, form a vote, include a vote about changing the form of government.
Yep.
So is his proposal going against the constitution and the national security concept of Mongolia?
Well, some lawyers they say he's the call for to vote whether Mongolia is a presidential country or parliamentary country. It's against the law. Some say that, and I get it. Probably there are some complex jurisdictional procedures for that. But if we look at our constitution that was somehow meddled, adopted and amended so many times before over the course of the last 27 years, we're a country right now that I would call it a half presidential and a half parliamentary country. Mm-hmm. So one way or another, that's the main question that needs to be addressed and answered as well. Yeah.
So people actually, again, need to be educated about the presidential country and the parliamentary country.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. If you look at our neighbors, Russia and China, so, these are countries with a presidential system, right? And if you look at the region as well, but Mongolia itself is standing alone as a country with a parliamentary system, and I think that's. We need to, if you look, we're dealing with consequences. We're not dealing with the causes. Mm-hmm. And the cause is that right now, our constitutional system, current constitution, is neither fish nor the flesh. So meaning that, that sooner or later, one way or another, we have to choose. And at least just put an end to that everlasting questions, right? And discussions.
Thank you about that. Now let's get into our second topic about the corruption case of custom inspector exposed. So the Independent Authority Against Corruption of Mongolia organized their monthly press conference early this weekend and provided new information to the public. During the conference, a corruption case related to the government officials were revealed. A video of a corruption case, which was revealed during the inspection at the customs agency, was presented to the public. Agents present at the conference said that this video was shown because there are no results nor changes being made, despite solving corruption cases of customs officers for the last 3 years. So our question about this case is that such videos, the Independent Authority Against Corruption of Mongolia leaked another video just a while ago. So such videos of government officials involved in corruption cases were leaked. And how effective is leaking videos about that?
Well, I do think it's quite effective, isn't it? Right? It's all about, the shaming corrupt government officials, right? So that's, if it helps, to fight with the corruptions, just let it be. Yeah,
but the videos were like many years ago, sometimes even.
Well, that's another story.
The thing is that when the videos are leaked, some of the officials, their cases it's not even solved at that moment.
No, yes, well, the good thing is that they're showing it. Mm-hmm. But it's totally another question, what's the reason behind? And I think since the new chairman for the anti-corruption agency has been appointed a few months ago, and every month the anti-corruption agency, they hold a press conference and informing the public about the improvements they make, right? And if showing the videos of corrupt officials helping to fight against the corruption, hell yes, they should show, they should continue it. But if it's misused and leaked for another purpose, that's another question.
How exactly does it affect the progress of the fighting corruption? First of all, you said it would shame the officials, and other than that?
Well, in the whole chain, you need to understand that the anti-corruption agency is not responsible for punishing let's say, the officials who were caught in a bribery. Because it requires, they investigate the case, and then they transfer the case to the prosecutor's office. And prosecutor's office decide whether the case is valid or not. If it's valid, then the court procedures take place. So, and one of the main objectives of the anti-corruption agencies is to educate people about, corruption cases, educating people that corruption is wrong, is damaging the economy. That's their main purpose. One of their main purposes is to educate people against the corruption.
I see.
It is not their purpose to punish the corrupted one, because it's a whole different procedure. Yeah.
So, is the methods of the Independent Authority Against Corruption improving over the years? Just like you said a few months ago, a new chief was appointed.
Yep.
So, with the new chief, is the methods improving?
Well, I don't know about the methodology. I think it's not a rocket science per se. Right? The methodology, it's quite. I think it's probably same in America, same in Russia, same in Mongolia. It's the same methodology applies, right? And as I said, that the anti-corruption agency is not the last institution to judge upon the crime, and prosecutors and the court are the institutions for the last verdict. So, and it requires involvement of the different judicial institutions to close the case. Mm-hmm. So we cannot just say, okay, the anti-corruption agency is a solely responsible body to fight against the corruption. Right? They investigate, as I said, they're investigating the case, they're making a public statements, and then they should educating the general public about the cons of bribery and corruption scandals.
I see. So, could you tell us about other nations' experience in this matter, and the most successful nations?
Well, look at China, what they're doing. They're really taking down corruption recently, right?
And how can their experience be introduced into Mongolia? Would it be possible?
That's a really good question. I think that's a question to the press secretary or to the chairman of the anti-corruption agency. Well, I know there are good BKMs, best known practices for sure, right? And but every best known practice should involve a good PR exposure of particular case. Because after all, you know, if you caught in a bribery process, I would personally feel a bit ashamed. So I think that's working on one's psychology and making the shame game. So that should work, yeah.
So is the leaked videos are from the cases that are already solved?
No, they're in the process of getting solved. I think they already transferred. I looked at some of the statistics. They said there are 34 cases that under investigations, and probably half of them already being moved to the prosecutor's office for further procedures and actions.
I see. So is with their thing, is the corruption and bribery in business environment is actually decreasing? Like they expose the government officials, but is the bribery in business environment actually decreasing? What are they doing about this one?
Well, I think, you know, the private companies are giving briberies to government officials in order to expedite a certain decision. Well, you know, it's very hard to say whether, you know, it's decreasing or increasing. I think this is something that probably the corruption agency should be providing more statistical information on the successful or unsuccessful cases. In my opinion, it got more sophisticated, maybe, because, you know, it's a whole different process, and it involves so many micro things that we cannot say just by leaking the certain video the corruption cases or statistics go down. It requires everyone's participations, right? The government institutions, judicial institutions, just the general public, and you and I. Everyone should be involved and stand against the corruption.
I see. So is there any, like, does the Authority Against Corruption of Mongolia, you know, do they, you know, reveal what kind of operations do they running? Do they run sting operations, or what kind of, like, do they have a transparency law about this? Or is everything in secret?
No, well, of course, you know, there's certain information kept under, you know, the confidentiality agreement, as far as I know. Of course, they do run some of the sting operations, but the sting operations should be closely conducted in a conjunction with the prosecutor's office, because after all, the prosecutor gives an order whether, you know, to detain or not to detain a certain person.
So after the investigation is done and that person, the suspect, is actually proved to have involved in a corruption case, and like some of them, you know, as Mr. Jargal said before, some of them just use the closing time of the case, and the prosecutors have the right to just close that case. So how can that system be improved? How can the suspects related to the corruption cases actually be punished for their crimes?
Well, I think, you know, judicially, again, you know, this is a call for constitutional amendments.
Right.
And because it's just a part of it. And if the anti-corruption bill is passed or amended with the certain roles and responsibilities of each institution, then we could probably see some notable improvements of solving and fighting against the corruption cases. That's my opinion. Yeah? And of course, you know, there have been some, as you said, some cases dropped as a statute of limitations.
Yeah.
So the case with the ex-Minister of Economy, Mr. Batbayr, and ex-MP, Mr. Karamga Batir. Well, it's showing that our constitution is still obsolete. It's still obsolete. We need to adopt a new constitution that serves for the purpose of the 21st century. The things are changing so rapidly, so why we should stick to a constitution that was written back in 1992.
I see. So let's get into our next topic about the Joint Investment Fund of Mongolia and Russia. Number of important agreements were signed during the visit of President of Russian Federation Vladimir Putin's visit to Mongolia. And one of these agreements was the Joint Investment Fund. The agreement will be made by the subsidiary company of the development bank, DBM Asset Management Limited Liability Company from the Mongolian side. And this asset management company was established in 2017 with the support from the government. So our first question about this topic is that what is Joint Investment Fund between Russia and Mongolia, and is establishing such fund with the Russian Federation a good decision?
Well, I think so. Certainly, it's welcome news. It's welcome news because if you look at the past, okay, let me say a few words about the Russian Russian Direct Investment Fund. I think so. That's the right word. So it was created in 2011, and it reports back straight away to the Prime Minister and to President Putin. So it's a pretty big organization. And since its establishment, I'll quote some numbers. They said, they already committed 1.5 trillion rubles. They invested over 100 billion rubles. And also they attracted $40 billion of foreign capital into a Russian economy. So it's a pretty good house, investment house.
Right.
That's one side of the story. The second side of the story, if you look at, for the last 25 years, especially at the big infrastructure projects, it was being funded in a form of a long-term government-to-government loans, right? Government of Mongolia, in order to invest and improve the infrastructure, they issued bonds, right? But after all, it's a credit, it's a loan, so that is put back on your shoulder and on mine shoulder, right? The problem with the big infrastructure project is that, first of all, they capital intensive, and the return on investment on infrastructure project, we're talking about, the 10 years, 15 years.
Right.
And the local financial institutions, they are failing to fund such big infrastructure projects. While, that the joint venture, that investment fund that was signed, it opens up a financial aggregate to fund the big infrastructure project in a form of equity. So it means you won't have a credit burden on your cash flow, but rather the Russian investment fund, along with DBM Asset Management, they will come as an institutional investors to ease off your credit cash flow. So this is a very important step for Mongolian companies or for individuals, the companies who are engaged in big infrastructure projects, or simply, have a good business partnership with the Russians.
I see. So how will this affect the infrastructures of the two countries? So, as you said before, it will affect it really good, but how will this affect Mongolia?
Well, it depends on us, certainly. It depends. We have to be very proactive right now, because the investments, the Russian Direct Investment Fund said, we're willing to support you. We're willing to provide you with an equity financing. Right. We're willing to act as your institutional investor. We are willing to support startups, infrastructure projects, just you name it, agriculture projects, right?
Right.
So it really down to us whether, we can utilize those sources efficiently and effectively.
So what kind of projects can be included, can sign up for this investment fund?
Oh, well, if you fancy of let's say, as an example, if you fancy of having a railway business, or setting up a railway business, passenger railway business between Moscow and Beijing that goes through Mongolia, and this is a private initiative, and if you can prove your case is sustainable, right? If you eliminate the country risks, So and then that the Russian investment fund says, we're willing to give you an equity financing.
I see. So when will this agreement come into effect?
Well, I think so. They just signed a general agreement on a partnership. I know within few months the fund will be officially up and running.
Within few months. So
yeah, within the few months, and I think so in 2019 they will start operating.
And the requirements for the projects that want to fund it from this will also be revealed.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. They're working out the logistics. They're working out, the procedures, how they should operate here in Mongolia. Yeah.
I see. So, why is this company DBM Asset Management is in charge of the agreement from the Mongolian side?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a subsidiary of the Development Bank of Mongolia. Development Bank of Mongolia is meant to finance the short-term infrastructure short-term projects.
Right.
But bank is a bank, and as I mentioned just a few minutes earlier, if you have a big project that is the payback is longer than 5 years, then it's not only for DBM but for the commercial banks to finance such project. So naturally, you need an institution that goes beyond that. Goes beyond the banking requirement,
right.
And then they're willing to act as an institutional investor. Not as a bank for giving you a credit or loan for a certain project, but coming to your project, helping you with the logistics and to set up the operation. This is what is really needed for Mongolia, and that's why the DBM Asset Management is a perfect match for the Russian Direct Investment Fund.
I see. So, what kind of what companies being involved in the company from the Russian side?
It's a direct agreement with the Russian
government. I see. So, why isn't the Mongolian government taking this into action?
Listen, unless you involve government, it's better for the private companies,
right.
Because the government imposes there's so many restrictions. Then after. It's very difficult. Just name me a very successful case of a government state-owned enterprise that runs successfully. But you name me a private company, any private company, successful company who's taking the risk, who's investing, and you probably can name dozens, right?
Right, but the development bank is funded from the government.
No, development bank is not funded by the government. I think the development bank is a company that attracts foreign investment sources and act as their agent here, as a fund here in Mongolia, in order to boost up the economic growth.
And the DBM Asset Management was established with the support from the government, even though they are
the major shareholder
independent from the government?
No, they're quite independent. Yes, the major shareholder is the Development Bank of Mongolia. But in the company bylaws, it's written they can act as an investment fund. And if you're acting as an investment fund, you have so many leverage to do the bridge financing, to provide the equity financing. Right?
I see. So with this new agreement, lots of opportunities will come in for the Mongolian people.
Certainly, yes.
Thank you for your time today.
Yep.
So that is all the time we have for today. We will see you next week with more topics. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a nice evening.